All right, now we're into socio-psychological tonight, so that's a little different, and it's a challenge for most of us. I don't know how you all feel about it, but my experience with students in this program is that most of them like the other traditions better. They like the critical traditions and the humanistic traditions, but there are people every so often who are really into quantitative socio-psychological theories. So, did that ring for anybody here? You like it? All right, good for you. Melissa?
I have a question. When we're done, can we just after you're finished explaining it and talking about it, can we just kind of go over the difference between that and the phenomenological one? Because I get them confused so much.
Okay. Yeah, well, let me see if I get this up. We may actually hit that before we get there. But some of you, I have people back due for presenting articles. I know Melissa has an article that she's going to present that relates to cybernetics and organizational communication. And so, did anyone else, who wrote me? You have a socio-psychological?
I hope so.
One? You hope so. Well, now that you're in OrdComm, you can't do anything wrong, so this is okay. We're good on that. And
I've got one too.
you got for tonight, or okay? I just want to know who wants to present tonight. Two of them. Yeah. So my plan is to do kind of an overview of how socio-psychological fits into the whole picture, and how it relates to differences. We could look at the Craig chart, but I'll save that depending on how. But Craig's chart will say how socio-psychological critiques the other traditions and how they critique socio-psychological. But we'll just get into the base differences here. All right, so let's jump in. And then I'm going to present something on Simlog. Who have I done Simlog with before? Nobody? All right, good. All right, so this is a socio-psychological theory of group analysis that is mentioned in your book under Robert Bales. And I did some specific training in this in San Diego before it burned some years ago. In 2000 I did this, or 2001 I think I did it. And I went out there for a week and I trained in this method of doing organizational analysis using Robert Bales' interaction analysis process. So I'm going to just report on that to you a little bit. I can go into that a little bit more deeply than some of these can. All right, so Little John and Craig both make the point that the socio-psychological is really the bulk of a lot of communication study. A lot of the writing and the publications for many, many years in the field were based on socio-psychological approaches. And one of the reasons for that is it is highly scientific in its methodology. So when we come to phenomenology and some of the other humanistic theories that we've been dealing with, they don't have that scientific rigor to them. They don't have that methodological quantitative figure things out, identify the trait, figure out how to measure it, then create a tool to measure it and do all this stuff. For a long time that was the core of what was done in communication theory. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the model of doing research that way was legitimate. So within the university system, it was how you demonstrated to the administration and to the university that you were a scientific department worthy of funding. So you did this kind of research that looked like everybody else's research. So to some extent, there was Bandura would say it's modeling, There was learned modeling that this succeeds. And so you do it. And so a lot of it was structured that way. Now, from a socio-psychological point of view, which is a little different from sociocultural, so let me kind of identify it differently from sociocultural to start with. Part of the question has to do with the self, or the existence of the communicator who is involved in the process of communicating. Now, before Mead, and we'll spend more time on George Herbert Mead and the mind and self and society at some point. Mead was one of the people who introduced a shift in the view of the self. So before Mead, largely you had an idea of what we can sometimes call an essentialist self. A self that who you are, that you arrive in the world as a package of characteristics and traits that can be determined through analysis. So you are somebody. This is called an essentialist view of the self, or sometimes called a noble self. Not in the sense of noble like princes and princesses and nobility, but noble in the sense of like the noble gases that didn't interact with other things, so that it remains intact. It stays what it is. So that who you are would remain the same throughout life, and you would be born with traits: friendliness, non-friendliness, cooperativeness, argumentativeness. And so you had all of these traits and characteristics. And so one of the wonderful things that became a debate among psychologists was, well, how many traits are there? You know, can we objectively describe the self? You know, can we objectively discover, you know, how memory works and how attitudes work, you know, attitude formation. What are you likely to be, conservative or liberal, you know, and how can we trace that down? Is that and part of the question became, what are the root traits that exist in a person? So here's a way to get at this idea of root traits or things. Suppose I were to ask you, what makes a good leader in an organization or a work group? I would ask you what makes a good leader. Let's just play with this for a few minutes. All right, so tell me something that makes a good leader. A trait that makes a good leader. What's that? Decisive. Decisive, okay. Decisive. What? Empathy. Okay, that they have empathy. Unbiased, so they're fair, we'll say.
Even-headed under pressure.
Okay, even-headed, they're calm. Okay. What's that? Okay, able to motivate. Now, we could go on like this for quite a long time, right? And we would end up with a whole set of traits and qualities that we believe make for the most effective leader. The question that researchers had, and social psychologists and psychologists had, is, are these just sort of, you know, if you take a tree with branches and then, you know, go off and more branches and branches, how do we tell the difference between what's a leaf and what's a branch and what's a root? How do we know that fairness doesn't come from being empathetic towards others? You know, how are we going to figure this out? And so people would do all of these studies and tests to figure out, can we get down to the how many things does it take? You know, how many traits really characterize people? You know, how many do we need to describe a person?
What about change? Like if you're born with these traits, do they feel like you just discovered a new one? Or?
Well, they wanted to say, initially they wanted to say that all human beings are characterized by these 3 traits, or these 4 traits. And that was the quest to some extent. We're going to look at 3 tonight that I think it's Bandura builds on in, builds on in learning theory of extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. 3 that they, one researcher who became well known said these are the 3 basic traits of human beings. And every other thing is a combination of these somehow. And so that became a question. How do we describe the human being? You know, and if we take for granted that people exist with a self, that they come into the world and they have traits and characteristics, how do we describe, you know, this is what theory does, describe, explain, predict human beings and human behavior. And so there were different answers, of course. Freud had an answer, right? Freud said that there were 3 parts to a person: ego, superego, and the id. Right, and then he described all of these. He said the id is this and this is. Now, if you do an autopsy on somebody, or you do a brain, you know, section, can you see 3 parts that are the id, the ego, and the superego? Right? No, you can't. So what we struggle with is this whole idea of constructs that we place, like the article we read, or in Littlejohn, I think it was, about action assembly theory. You know, it's like, okay, well, this comes down the chute, and then it gets linked to this and processed and put in this box, and then it gets stored with other nodes and all that stuff. Well, what is that? You know?
Is it extroversion, consciousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, and openness to experience? Are those the 5?
No, I mean, Eysenck came down to 3. I think Bandura had, how many? I thought he had 5 or 6.
Those are 5, because it's like a popular like MySpace thing that I always see on people's profiles. It's like to see your 5.
Oh, really?
It, like, I don't know, it's MySpace, but
that's
it's
interesting.
like one of those quizzes you could take, and it tells about your personality. So I just didn't know if it was that. Cause
I don't know. I've never heard that before. But if that is the case, what happened was somebody with a psychologist or social psychologist background put it up there somewhere, and it took. We're going to talk about measurements, how you measure psychological and communication traits in a little while, you know, and so that gets into questions of methodology, which is not what we're doing. We're doing theory, but you have to talk about that in social psychology. So anyway, before Mead, largely before Mead, you had this approach that what our goal is to identify the core traits and characteristics of people, and then begin to describe everything in terms of that. Now, those of you who took geometry in high school will remember Euclid. You remember Euclid? And Euclid gave us axioms and then theorem and things that built on it, right? And so to some extent, this is the model of science. What we want to do is find the fundamental parts and then how those parts combine in order to create what we see and know. So to some extent, social psychology is about what are the base things in the self, and then when we talk about someone being an argumentative person, how does that relate to their neuroticism, their extroversion, and their, you know, how is this quality 1 is this trait 1 plus this trait 2 plus this trait 3. You know, that that this is a result of a combination of these things. Now, this is not a, this is an illustrative thing, you know. But I mean, you'll see this all through this literature. People will construct these mathematical equations that say how a certain trait, like argumentativeness, is this, you know, x times t1 times y times t2 times z times trait 3, you know, and so this was the scientific model for putting all these things together. Now, so can we objectively discover what is in the human mind and describe it? Now, Mead came along and said the self and mind are social. So this was a big thing. This is 1930s when George Herbert Mead came along and said, you know, we're trying to study human beings as if they were like these individual things that didn't interact and change with others. He says, but really, the self is a social self, a reflexive self. It is formed out of complex interaction with others. And so who you are is not some noble self that just emerged, that came along with your birth, and it just unfolds itself through your whole life. Which is kind of interesting when you think about this whole authentic self movement, right? Which is kind of this, but the Mead's view is that our self is formed in the interaction that we have, and we have this I part and this me part, and we form ourselves on the basis of what we think others think about us. So I come to think of myself in terms of your views of me. Then that feeds back into me, which then shapes how I respond to you, which then reinforces your view of me, and this whole interaction takes place. This is called the looking glass self. Right? So have you heard that before? You've done that before? Right? So the social psychologist is kind of operating somewhere in here. You know, a lot of what we talk about in dialogue and phenomenology and stuff is kind of operating way over here. But some communication theorists are operating over here. You know, and some are operating in here and some are operating in here. So when you read people's literature reviews, you want to pay attention to who they're citing, because it'll give you a clue what their view of the self is, and whether their goal is to, you know, get at the root of all these traits and then describe people, and then if we act on these traits, will then affect all of these outcomes. So if I can find the root trait and I can influence it, that will have multiple outcomes in a human life. So we work on that. So from this diagram's perspective, sorry. So you have a person. And within that person are mental processes, right? And so the social psychologist is interested in what goes on inside a person's mind. How does that work? How do we change our attitudes? How do we form attitudes? How do we change how do we try to persuade other people to change their attitudes or behaviors? So these are the kind of questions. We look at questions of what's going on inside the mind. How do people remember things? How do people create sentences? And how do we put words together and speak? That's a social psychologist question. So he's interested in mental processes, which are part of the person. How are decisions made? what are the factors that go into decisions. So what I was going to say over here, I lost track of it before I finished, was that this is sometimes known as factor analysis, where out of 400 possible variables that are affecting something, can we boil it down to the 3 or 5 variables that really count? So, and which ones are the base variables versus which ones are the ones further down the line. So factor analysis. So we try to figure out, well, how do people make decisions? Right? So let's just play with this for a minute. What goes into a person's making of a decision?
Previous experiences.
Okay, previous experiences with this, of any purchase or of this purchase.
Weighing results.
What they expect to be, there's expected results versus actual results, their relationships with others, the financial cost involved, the social, what's that?
Pros and cons.
The pros and cons of it. From a social perspective, will this increase my likability with other people? Well, so I mean, you can begin to multiply these variables, and they can go on, so that decision is a product or a end result of, like we say, you know, past history plus goals that they have, plus the results, plus the costs, plus, so you have to take all these things into account. And the social psychologist wants to try to do this in a comprehensive way. They want to get at everything that's really essential to this. And so you can see how a lot of this has a lot to do with multiplying all kinds of variables in the human communication situation. And then you factor in communication. What kind of media communication have they had? How much of that have they had? What have been the, you know, what have been the appeals of that? How many core appeals are there? So it gets highly complicated as you go on. And then, so as you move up though, that's the psychological part. Then you get the social part. How does interaction affect the psychology of the individual person? You know, so communication, impression management. So again, into my decision to buy or to do something enters the question of my managing my impression with other people. So what will they think if I do this? You know, what will this person, what will my significant people think? Well, how do I measure how many significant people and how significant they are? You know, how do I calculate all that stuff? And then that relates to the whole social structure, because there are norms within the social structure that say it's desirable to have these things. Like I was looking on the web just recently. I can't remember how I came to this. Oh, I really know. I had a student last semester who did a report on knockoff designer clothes and items. And she was all wrapped up in this question of why would people buy knockoff items? You know, and so I was doing some looking at this, and I didn't realize you could rent handbags. This was very cool.
Oh man.
Yeah, bag, borrow, or steal. And it was fascinating. And I said, all right, I got to find the most expensive thing here. I got to see how much you could do with this. And I found some bag that you could rent for $240 a week or $840 a month. So if you have a couple of important events to go to, you would rent your handbag, I guess, you know. Well, a social psychologist, communication studies, would love this, you know, because the social psychologist communicator would say, all right, this is a symbolic action, you know, for a purpose by an agent who has goals. Oh man, I'm in my home turf here, social psychology. You know, well, what are the variables that are involved and the cost? versus the social cost versus the economic cost, you know, and how do I create a theory about why people would do this, that explains why people would do this. And so now the phenomenologist would go at that a whole different way, right? Phenomenologists would interview you and say, well, what's the significance of this to you and why is it important to you? But a social psychologist would say, let me find the variables, let me arrange them in a formula, you know, or in a relationship with each other. Let me find the core variables that affect all the other variables, and let me do research that verifies my hypotheses that I have about this. So if anyone wants to figure out the handbag thing, you know, you can do that. Well, in your world, with the music industry, it's probably a big thing, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's this forum called firstblog.com, and they have it like by designers, and they can authenticate the bag for you. Like, let's say if you're bidding on something on eBay, you can go in there, you can go to this specific designer, post the links, and they'll tell you whether it's fake or not. Like,
it's a whole world, right?
By invitation only, you can only join by invitation.
Yeah. See, now a semiotician would ask, well, what's going on with the bag symbol thing? A phenomenologist would ask, what does it mean to people? Social psychologists would say, what are the root variables that are engaged here? How are they related to other ones? And can I create a theory that will explain this, that what is going on and what the variables are that are part of it? So that's different.
And would that theory likely contain numbers and measurements that, like, if you have this level of
yes.
neediness,
yes.
you know, and
now.
I don't know what the things are that would lead you to do
well,
that,
you would create a measurement tool
right.
that would measure handbag importance.
Right.
You know, and handbag importance is calculated by, you know, which of these three fields, which do you work in? Entertainment, sports, or medicine, you know? And so if you circle this one, you get 10 points in your bag calculation, you know? And how often do you attend, you know, important public relations functions, you know? And how, you know, and you would, a social psychologist would have the variables and then would have the instrument that you would hand out to people to measure, and then you would predict their communication behaviors on the basis of their scores on your instrument. Yeah, so it's a highly rigorous kind of a field to get into. Now, I was a mathematics major in college, you know, I mean, my undergraduate degree is in mathematics, but I don't even appreciate it. I mean, it's just too much for me, because I have problems with the idea that you can figure out what root things are that exist across time and across cultures. I just don't go there. I'm a median, you know, I'm more of a sociocultural person. So, but some people are really here, and like Berger, we're going to look at Berger's uncertainty reduction theory, which has its axioms and its theorems, and that's the way he goes. So this is, I thought this was nice. This was a nice diagram that I found that says that all of these things interact. For a social psychologist, not just a psychologist, but a social psychologist, he says that there are people who have mental processes that are affected by their interaction and that are shaped by the culture in which they live. So any of these things become fair game for the social psychologist to explain, to describe, explain, predict, and control, or shape in communication behaviors. So that's part of that.
How would they describe, like, with the one self, how would they describe how a person can act completely different, like, based on their setting, on their, like, you know, when they're with a certain group of people, they act one way.
Right.
And when they're...
Well, I think that and I'll let others try to, you know, shoot at it first. I'll give you some thoughts about it. So person A in context B acts this way. They behave in type 1, we'll call it. This is very social psychological to do, right? And in context C, they engage in behavior 2. Right, so now we have a diagram of the person behaving differently in 2 different contexts. Okay, so your question is?